completely contradicts the genre coding of conventional pornography. There are a few other elements because I use letters here, and if you get close to the work, there are other things that you can read in the work by actually looking at the letters themselves. In this case, I have combined two things that are traditionally perceived to not being reconcilable, and they are pornography and geometry. If we look linguistically, what I'm doing, I am basically permutating a very vulgar word associated with the human body in a composition that is geometric in structure. So you arrive at the new unit that results from the combination of two elements that are traditionally seen as being discrete. A lot of these works continue along the same lines from the porn art movement. This one, for example, belongs to a series called Pornograms, in which I use my own body to write as a writing instrument. And in this case, you see me on the right, and my girlfriend at the time. We are making the letter U, which forms the phonetic unit of booing. Woo! So we boo with the body, we laugh with or at the viewer, we cover what is normally seen, we exhibit what is normally covered. We are floating, we are falling. So it produces a tension, a semantic tension, that is completely unlike conventional pornography, and it's the body at the service of poetry. And that is a characteristic of the kind of work that I did at the time. This is also from that period in his own view as well. And you may recognize this as being the logo of the Xerox company. So I used the logo, but not only, I also used the logic that was employed in the creation of the logo as structural in the composition. Because xerography comes from graphos, writing, and xeros, which is dry. So xerography is dry writing because, of course, there is no wet process in photocopying. But a wordsmith created Xerox, so it becomes a brand. So I use that logic in the creation of the composition. So eros, from erotic, eros, becomes erox. Erection becomes erex. The next word is an extremely vulgar word in Portuguese. It would be difficult to translate, but it becomes xerex, and then in the end you have xerox. But if you look vertically in the middle, you'll find the key to unlock the piece. Sexo becomes sexo, and rex, or king in Latin, with the R reversed, becomes a way of saying that I do not recognize the rulers in control of the country now. My body is my domain. I am the king of my own domain. If you imagine turning this composition 90 degrees, you see that it produces a vaginal form. Turn it 90 degrees in the opposite direction, and then you have two things on each side and one protruding in the middle. Which direction should it go? Now, this one is very political and whimsical at the same time. If you can read Portuguese, and I think this works well in Spanish as well, o poeta tem papel na sociedade. El poeta tiene papel en la sociedad. In Portuguese, this word, papel, is paper and roll, social role. The poet has a social role. And this is a photocopy on toilet paper. With inflation at 100%, you might as well use sandpaper because let's just say this was extremely rough. So photocopying on toilet paper was extremely difficult, extremely difficult. But it gives a material reality to the conditions that everyone was living under. The title of this work is Primavera, or Spring, because that's the brand of the toilet paper that everyone could afford at the time. Now, if you look in the background, you have this luxurious wrapping paper. So a contrast established between the haves and the have-nots. You cannot read because the projection is too small, but if you look at the work in the booth, you will see that at the bottom, you have associated with these symbols the words mother in the living room, father by the window, car, motel, bed, and gate, associated with each symbol. And at the top, you have a piece of cloth that is photocopied. So I ask you to read those symbols in the cloth as a narrative, freely. And I work with the same cloth in a very different way here, in basically creating a free gesture in space. It's, in a sense, a trace, an emotional trace within the machine. A choreography. So no verbal interaction. You replace the content of the interaction with images. You establish a dialogue through images alone. So we did all kinds of different projects, and among the several projects that I did, I made a fax movie by placing the fax machine in the gallery and inviting artists around the world to transmit sequential imagery to that particular fax machine. So the movie self-edited in the order that the faxes were received. So we're looking at a 30-meter long fax, exactly in the order that it arrived in the gallery. "30 meters, 30 days, 30 seconds. So I carried out all kinds of fax experiments in those days. And I also started to work in holography. I started to work in holography in '83. And my very first holographic work is at the Uecla collection here in Essex, in the UK. And we have one hologram in the booth, which is this. And also in the 80s, I started, and I think I will basically show you this and conclude with some of these later 80s works. We do have a photograph of my second telepresence robot on the wall. In 1986, I started what I called telepresence art. And telepresence reverses the experience that you have conventionally on the telephone. When you talk on the telephone, you transmit your voice and you have a very clear sense of the remote presence of your friend, the one you're speaking with. Telepresence does the opposite. Telepresence gives you a sense of your presence elsewhere. So, you will see on the wall in the booth a black and white 1989 vintage photograph of this particular robot, platypus, ornitorrinco. And in this vintage footage, you see that people use the keypad on the telephone to navigate in the body of the telerobot. You see, they're looking through the eye of the robot, discussing where to go, pressing the keys on the telephone, and then actually going there, and their point of view changes because they just took a step forward and to the left. Remember, this is way before the web. This is 1989. So there's no web to work with. The only network that we had was the telephone network. And because everybody had the telephone, I simply used the keypad on the existing phone as a way to navigate. You press 2, which is at the top, you'd go forward. To the left of 2 is 1, so you press 1, you go left. To the right of 2 is 3, you press 3, you go right. So I just used the phone as it was, and when the sounds arrived at the other end, the robot interpreted the sounds as control directions. You know, it just went to the left or to the right. When you press 5, you'd stop and you'd retrieve an image as well. You press 8, you went backwards, and so on and so forth. So 1989, and I continued to develop telepresence art until 2001 was my last work of telepresence art. But that brings us to the 21st century. So I think this gives you a good idea of the context and shows you footage that you don't see in the booth. And just to remind you that this is work from the 80s because of this particular selection that the curator did, which is interesting for me because I rarely show work from the 80s. I show primarily work that I do now. But since the Reina Sofia exhibition in 2012, Perder la Forma Humana, a lot of curators and collectors and writers have been asking about these works from the 80s. So for me, it's a great opportunity. It's fascinating to get them out of boxes and the archive after 30 years not being shown, and have this opportunity to show them for the first time. So thank you all for being here and for this opportunity. Thank you. That's it. Quick overview.